with this current literacy crisis. Have you seen those viral videos where adults struggle to read a sentence on a note card? Can the kids read? Yes or no? If you had an immediate response or a visceral reaction to any of those questions, you are in the right place today. Welcome to the Education Evolution. I am your host, Lindsay, affectionately known as Miss Black. You're listening to Lifelong Learning. This is a podcast for the thinkers, the doers, and those who understand that the most important lessons aren't always learned in school. Welcome back to the show. If you're new here, welcome. It is truly a pleasure to have you in this little virtual learning community that we built. Now, before we get started, let me make something clear. This episode is not about placing blame, not on the teachers, not on the parents, not even on the curriculum per se. This episode is about understanding the timeline of the recent history of reading. Because lately it feels like everywhere you look, somebody's talking about that damn literacy crisis. People are posting videos of adults struggling to read. People are saying the kids can't read anymore. They saying them young folk on Love Island can't read either. And it's just not as simple as that. I am a former educator myself, so I generally have more context on the learning of literacy. And because this episode is dedicated to the lifelong learner, which is you, my duty by the end of this episode is to give you more background information on a literacy crisis and the historical timeline that got us here. Before we get into deep, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Your like, your comment, and subscription get us closer to feeding the streets real knowledge that is useful for our everyday lives, regardless of career or background. Our goal is to continue growing this community of lifelong learners. So be thinking about who you might want to share this video with as you listen. Now, let's establish why this conversation is happening. According to the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, only about 30% of fourth graders scored at or above the NAEP proficient level in reading, and only 29% of eighth graders reached that level. On the adult side, an international organization called the OECD, which studies education and workforce skills across developed countries, found that about 28% of US adults perform at the lowest literacy levels measured. Now, while this does sound alarming, it is, statistics never tell the entire story. There are large discrepancies in how the US defines reading proficiency. The statistic that only one third of students are proficient readers can be misleading because NAEP proficient is a higher standard than grade level reading. And most states consider students reading at the basic level on the NAEP to be grade level. So the untrained ear hears that only 30% are reading on grade level. And that's just not true based on the nature of the assessment. Reading outcomes are also influenced by many factors, including, but of course not limited to, poverty, access to books, teacher preparation, school funding, language acquisition, attendance, and many other factors. But regardless of the exact numbers, and no matter how you interpret them, people are wondering, well, how the hell did we get here? The first thing we have to understand is actually neuroscience, because here's something a lot of people don't know. Humans are born to speak. However, we are not necessarily born to read. Think about it, okay? Nobody teaches a baby how to learn spoken language, right? Babies hear the language, they imitate language, and eventually they begin speaking. Reading doesn't work that way. Reading is actually a cultural invention. It's only been around for a few thousand years, so not nearly long enough for humans to evolve a part of the brain dedicated solely to reading. Instead, our brains have to create new pathways by connecting areas already responsible for vision, spoken language, sound processing, and memory. Beginning in the 1990s, researchers used brain imaging technology to better understand what happens when we learn to read. One of the biggest discoveries was this. For most children, reading has to be explicitly taught. It doesn't develop naturally the way spoken language does. And that scientific understanding becomes really important as we move through this timeline. Now let's back up a few decades, beginning in the 1970s and becoming even more popularized during the 1980s and 1990s was an instructional philosophy called whole language. Whole language was based on a pretty simple idea. Children learn to speak naturally, so maybe they'll learn to read naturally too. Instead of focusing first on individual sounds and letters, whole language emphasized surrounding children with rich literature. So students were encouraged to read books, write more often, use pictures and context, not just to better understand the story, but as a tool to read the words on a page. There's a difference there, and we'll get into that. Students were asked to think about what made sense in a sentence. This philosophy prioritized meaning. So the goal wasn't to just create readers, it was really to create children who loved reading and had a relationship with reading. Now, it's important to understand that this approach came from a very genuine desire to improve literacy and engagement. And you yourself may have been able to grasp reading from this approach. You may know a lot of people who are stellar readers due to whole language training. It is possible. But over time, research and educators began asking an important question. What about the students who weren't figuring it out? What about children who needed more explicit instruction to connect letters with sounds? That question will lead us into the next chapter of literacy learning entitled Balanced Literacy. See where I'm going here? Okay. Balanced literacy emerged as an attempt to combine the strengths of whole language with a more direct phonics approach. The thinking here was maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other, okay? Maybe it can be both. A balanced literacy classroom often included read alouds, guided reading where there were small groups of children reading the same book to work on the same skill, opportunities for independent reading within class, and phonics instruction. One of the most recognizable names associated with the movement is Lucy Calkins through the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project of Columbia University. Her work influenced thousands of schools across the country and like is still in schools today. Supporters appreciated the emphasis on authentic reading and student choice and writing. Over time, one of the biggest criticisms though of balanced reading wasn't that phonics wasn't taught at all. It was that in some classrooms, explicit phonics instruction became inconsistent. And students were sometimes encouraged to rely more heavily on pictures, context clues, and what made sense in the sentence than on actually decoding and breaking down the words that were on the page. Now, if you don't have an education background, that might sound really abstract. So let me give you an example. Okay. Imagine I text you, hey, I'm running a little. Most of y'all immediately filled in the blank with the word late. Why? Because it makes sense. But what if the actual word was behind or early or delayed? You didn't actually read the word. You predicted what it was based on the context. Reading eventually has to move beyond prediction. It has to be become decoding the actual word that's on the actual page. Okay, here's another way to think about it. Imagine every stop sign suddenly had the word stop covered up. Okay. Most people would still know it was a stop sign, not because you read them letters, but because you recognize the shape, the color, and the context. That is pattern recognition, not actual reading. Reading requires you to look at the letters, connect them to sounds, blend those sounds together, and actually decode the words in front of you. And it's not that context clues are bad. They absolutely have a place in literacy and how we interact with the world. But the question is, when should students use context clues? And when should they explicitly be taught how to decode words independently? That question is what fueled much of the conversation that eventually led us to what we now call the science of reading, which we're going to get to, but I have something to address before we even go on. Let's talk about No Child Left Behind. Because I see y'all joking in the comments all the time and throwing this in there. I know y'all seen the videos on Instagram where a guy is asking random people to read a sentence on a note card, likely after they walk out of a nightclub. Like it's always like night. Maybe they left a bar. And a lot of people are struggling through it with words like sophisticated or demeanor throwing people off. And then someone on comments is always like, then was the children that was left behind. Perhaps they break this down a bit and rewind back to 2002. Congress passed the No Child Left Behind Act, often referred to as NCLB. There's some big misconceptions around No Child Left Behind that I want to clear up. NCLB was not a reading curriculum, okay? I mean, it wasn't a curriculum at all. It did not tell teachers how to teach anything, let alone reading. That's actually part of the gaps with this legislation. It was an accountability law. Its purpose was to measure student achievement across the country using standardized assessments, especially in reading and math. For the first time, schools had to publicly report student performance, not just overall, but by student group, including students with disabilities, English learners, and economically disadvantaged students. They couldn't count any group out and just brush it under the rug. Now, there were important benefits with the act. Achievement gaps became much more visible, which means all people had to talk about them, not just advocates of certain groups. States had more consistent data, not just data on how Colorado kids performed on an assessment created by Colorado leaders. You see where I'm getting at there? And that made reading and math become national priorities. But there were also some obvious criticisms because schools became heavily focused on testing. Tests were not inclusive, and they're still, some people would say they're still not. For example, if you're reading a passage about a creek when your neighborhood or city doesn't have a creek, That can really throw off your score as a student on that specific task because you don't have the context to understand what that word means. All this meant instructional time also shifted towards testing subjects. So some schools narrowed their curriculum, and many educators argued that schools were being held accountable without receiving enough resources, staffing, or support to meet increasingly ambitious goals that came out of No Child Left Behind. So you'll often hear people say or read in the comments, those are the children that got left behind. That's the No Child Left Behind kids over there. But the children were already left behind, okay? And there are still lots of children being left behind. The act brought transparency to the number of children left behind. It did not directly correlate to how students were being taught and what tools, okay? I had to clear that up because some people are saying that are part of the children that were left behind. Like they were your friends, they were your classmates, they were people at your school in your community, okay? I wanted to be clear that the teachers did not teach them, and that's why they were left behind. There were already structural issues in how we learned and how we held schools accountable to learning. Fast forward to today. Some of you may have read the phrase, the science of reading. And if you haven't, and you believe there's truly a literacy crisis, you're going to want to lean in and listen more. Here's what it actually means. The science of reading is not a curriculum. It is a large body of interdisciplinary research that has been gathered over decades from neuroscience, psychology, linguistics, education, and speech language research. Researchers asked one central question: how does the brain learn to read? And based on that research, they found that effective reading instruction generally includes explicit teaching in phonemic awareness, which is hearing sounds, phonics, which is connecting letters and sounds. Fluency is reading smoothly, vocabulary, language comprehension, reading comprehension. Y'all, it's just lots of moving parts when you think about what it actually takes to read. The emphasis is on systematic, explicit instruction, especially during the earliest stages of learning to read. The science of reading says that for many children, especially beginning readers, the foundational skills of decoding words needs to be taught directly. As of the end of 2024, 40 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws or adopted policies supporting evidence-based reading instruction. That is remarkable. This wasn't the national conversation 10 or 15 years ago. I want y'all to really think about that. This just got passed in 40 states in 2024. That was 2 years ago. So it's one of the biggest instructional shifts happening in American education right now. And here's why that matters. Education doesn't usually change this quickly. Schools are giant systems. Curriculum adoption actually takes years. Teacher preparation takes years. Professional development takes years. So when you see over 40 states moving in a similar direction, that's a pretty significant signal that policymakers and education leaders believe the research has reached a point where it's influencing how reading should be taught. So when people are discussing the literacy crisis at brunch or in the comments in relation to teenagers or the kids on Love Island, and the question of how do we get here gets raised, you now have been equipped with way more background information to really have a critical conversation to answer that question. Because context changes conversations. It's not enough to just name the crisis. It's important we know the historical timeline and how we arrived here in order to all play a part, whether it's big or small, with making change in our learning systems and how we as adults engage with literacy in our everyday lives. So it's not just them kids. It's not. I'm Lindsay Black. And if this episode made you say, I didn't know that, share it with someone, maybe a friend with a child, a teacher. Hell, post a link on your Instagram story today, right now. Learning gets better when it's shared. And if you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comments. What surprised you the most? Was it learning that our brains aren't naturally wired to read? Or was it finally understanding what No Child Left Behind actually was? Or maybe it was seeing how all these moments connect together over time. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe so we can continue building the community of lifelong learners. Until next time, stay curious, stay teachable, and remember, understanding the past helps us make better decisions about the future. I'll see y'all next time.